They buried her alive for breaking the god's laws. 3 days later, the shrine that condemned her was nothing but ash, and the priest never walked out of it. Nobody in that village ever agreed on what happened that night. Some still won't speak of it at all. This is the story of the only girl in her village who never obeyed the gods, and what her silence finally woke up. My name doesn't matter. What matters is the name they gave her, Adaeze, the king's daughter. A name too big for a girl the village would spend her whole life trying to make small. Eke-Oba was a village stitched between two rivers, in the heart of land so red and so fertile that yams grew fat without much cooking. But fertile soil breeds fear just as easily as it breeds food. And the people of Eke-Oba feared the gods the way a child fears the dark. Not because they had ever seen what was hiding in it, but because they had been told since before they could speak that something terrible lived there. The shrine sat on the hill above the village, wrapped in iroko trees so old that their roots had pushed up through the earth like the knuckles of buried giants. No one remembered who built the shrine. No one remembered when the gods first spoke. All anyone knew were the rules, passed mouth to mouth, generation to generation, until they hardened into something heavier than law, something sacred, something you did not question. 4 rules. Only 4. But 4 rules can cage an entire world if you let them. Never help a stranger after the sun goes down. Never go near anyone the shrine has marked. When the priest tied a red cord to a person's wrist, that person was already gone, even if their heart still beat. Never question the priest. Whatever he says, whatever he does, however strange his eyes look when the moon is full. Never plant a single seed before the sacred festival, no matter how dry the season threatens to become, no matter how the children's bellies start to hollow out waiting. The priest's name was Babatunde Adaeze. Baba Adaeze, the village called him, with their heads bowed and their voices small. He wore white wrapped around a chest gone soft with age, and around his neck hung a string of cowries that clicked like teeth when he walked. He spoke for the gods, he spoke for the shrine, and whatever Baba Adaeze said, the people of Eke-Oba did, because the alternative, the punishment for disobedience, was a thing they whispered about, but never ever wanted to see for themselves. Crops failed in homes that broke the rules, children sickened, husbands disappeared into the bush and never came home. At least, that's what the elders said. That's what everybody believed. Everybody except Adaeze. She was 16 the first time she broke a rule, and she broke it without even deciding to. It was the rainy season's edge, the night air still warm, and a man came stumbling into the village square long after the cooking fires had been doused. He was a stranger, soaked, shaking, blood-crusted dark along one arm. He had been attacked on the forest road. He begged on his knees for water, for shelter, for anyone to bind his wound before he bled out under their indifferent stars. Doors closed, shutters slammed. Mothers pulled their children back from windows as if the stranger's suffering might leak inside and infect them. Because everyone knew the rule. Never help a stranger after sunset. The gods had said so. Baba Adaeze had repeated it 100 times from the shrine steps. A stranger who comes after dark is not always a man. Sometimes he is a spirit wearing a man's skin, sent to test you, sent to curse the house that opened its door to him. Adaeze stood in her doorway and watched her whole village turn its back on a dying man. She did not weigh the rule against the punishment for very long. She simply walked out into the rain, knelt beside him, and pressed her own wapa against the wound until the bleeding slowed. She brought him into her mother's compound, her mother screaming at her the whole time, certain that doom had just crossed their threshold. And she nursed that stranger through the night with shaking hands and a heart pounding so loud she thought the whole village could hear it. By morning, the stranger was alive. By morning, the whispers had already started. Adaeze touched a night walker. Adaeze invited a curse into her mother's house. That girl has never had any respect for the gods. The man recovered. He thanked her with tears in his eyes, said she had a heart bigger than fear, and then he left the way he came, vanishing down the forest road before anyone else could question him. No curse came, no sickness fell on the compound. The yams in Adaeze's mother's field grew taller that season than anyone else's. But the village did not see safety in that. They saw something worse. They saw a girl the gods had somehow let get away with disobedience, and that frightened them more than any curse could have. That was only the beginning. Stay with me, because what happens next is the reason this story has survived 200 years in the mouths of grandmothers, and it's about to get a lot more dangerous for our girl. If this story has already pulled you in, tap subscribe now, because the deeper we go, the harder it becomes to look away. The second time Adaeze broke a rule, the whole village watched her do it. There was a boy named Chiedu, a quiet boy who herded goats on the eastern slope and never said much to anyone. One dry season, Chiedu began to cough blood. His skin turned the color of old ash. Baba Yase, summoned to examine him, declared, in that flat, final voice he used when delivering judgment, that the gods had marked Chiedu. He tied the red cord around the boy's thin wrist himself, in front of Chiedu's mother weeping, in front of the whole gathered village. He belongs to the shrine now, Baba Yase said. Whoever touches him touches what is no longer his to touch. It meant abandonment. It meant Chiedu would be carried to the forbidden grove behind the shrine and left there, the way every marked person before him had been left there for the gods to claim. No one ever saw a marked person again. No one asked where they went. You simply did not ask. Chiedu's mother collapsed in the dirt, clawing at her own chest, begging Baba Yase for mercy. But mercy was not a word the shrine recognized. Two of the priest's attendants lifted the boy, barely fighting, barely conscious, and began the long walk up the hill. Adaeze followed them. Her own mother grabbed her wrist so hard it left bruises, hissing at her to stop, to think of her family, to think of what would happen to all of them if she defied the shrine in front of the entire village. Adaeze pulled free anyway. She had pulled free of fear before, and something in her, something older than her 16 years, something that felt less like courage and more like an ache she couldn't ignore, told her that this boy's life was worth more than her own safety. She didn't reach the grove in time to stop them from leaving him there, tied to a stake beneath the iroko trees, alone in the dark with whatever the gods intended to do with him. The attendants warned her, faces pale with their own fear, that she would be cursed too if she lingered. They left. Adaeze did not leave. She sat beside Chiedu through the night, in defiance of every law the village had ever taught her, waiting for whatever monstrous thing was supposed to come for him. She held his hand. She sang to him, the way her own mother used to sing to her before fear had hardened her mother's voice into warnings and rules. Nothing came. No spirit, no god, no claw reaching out of the dark to drag the boy into the underworld. Just the wind moving through the iroko leaves, and an owl somewhere far off, and the slow, ragged breathing of a sick boy who needed medicine, not abandonment. By dawn, Adaeze had carried Chiedu, small as he was, light as a bundle of dry firewood from the sickness, down the hill on her own back, past the shrine, past the sleeping huts, to the river's edge, where an old healer woman lived apart from the village, a woman the priest had long ago declared unclean and forbidden anyone to visit. The healer woman took one look at Chiedu and said one word, poison. Not a curse, not a divine mark. Poison, the slow kind, the kind that built up over weeks in food or water, the kind that explained exactly why his skin had turned that strange ash color and why his blood came up dark when he coughed. It took 11 days. 11 days of bitter roots boiled into broth, of cold compresses, of the healer woman's steady, patient hands. On the 11th day, Chiedu opened his eyes and asked, in a small, clear voice, for his mother. He was alive. The boy the gods had marked for death was alive, hidden by the river, healed by hands the shrine had called forbidden. Now, think about that for a moment. A poison, not a curse. Somebody poisoned that boy, and somebody in that village knew exactly who. Keep that thought, because it's about to matter more than you think. When Adaeze brought Chiedu back to his mother's compound, the woman wept so hard she could not stand, clutching her son as though she might lose him all over again simply by loving him too tightly. But the celebration in that one household did not spread to the rest of the village. Instead, fear spread, thicker and colder than before. Because a marked boy had survived, because the rule everyone had obeyed their whole lives, the rule that said the marked belonged to the shrine and no one else, had just been broken in plain sight, and nothing terrible had happened. No plague, no drought, no vengeance from the sky. That should have given the village hope. Instead, it gave them something far more dangerous: doubt about their own faith and rage at the girl who had caused it. Babayase called an emergency gathering at the shrine that same evening. He stood on the worn stone steps, his cowrie necklace clicking with every furious gesture, and he told the village that Adaeze's defiance had not saved Chiedu, it had only delayed the god's judgment, and now the god's anger would fall on the whole village instead of one boy. You see her kindness, and you call it good. But I tell you, the gods do not measure good the way foolish girls measure good. Obedience is the only goodness that matters. A girl who disobeys, even for love, even to save a child, is still a girl who has opened her heart to corruption. Corruption wears gentle faces. That is how it tricks the weak. Most of the village believed him. Fear is easier to carry when someone hands you a clear enemy to blame it on. And Adaeze had just made herself that enemy. But not everyone believed him. There was an old woman at the edge of that gathering. A woman so old that no one could quite remember when she had arrived in Eke-Oba, only that she had always seemed to be there, sitting at the margins of every important moment, watching with eyes that seemed to hold more years than the Iroko trees themselves. The villagers called her Mama Nneka, though some children whispered she wasn't really anyone's mama at all, that she simply appeared whenever trouble was near and vanished again when it passed. That night, as the crowd dispersed in fearful, muttering clusters, Mama Nneka found Adaeze sitting alone by the river, where she had gone to be away from the accusing eyes of her own village. "You are not cursed, child," the old woman said, settling onto a rock beside her without invitation. "You are the only one of them still awake." Adaeze looked up, startled. "Awake?" "They sleep with their eyes open," Mama Nneka said. "They have slept that way for 200 years. You are the first one in all that time who has not let them put you to sleep too." Pay close attention here, because this is where the story stops being what you think it is. Everything you believed about the gods of Eke-Oba is about to fall apart, and if you don't want to miss exactly how, make sure you've already subscribed, because this twist only gets bigger from here. Mama Nneka told her the truth that night, in pieces, the way you feed a starving person slowly so the shock of it doesn't kill them. 200 years before, Eke-Oba had real guardians. Not gods exactly, but spirits of the land bound to protect the people who lived on it, the way a river protects the fish that swim inside it. These guardians asked for almost nothing. A handful of kola nut in planting season, a song at harvest, respect freely given, never demanded through fear. Then a famine came, the worst the land had ever known, and in the desperation of that famine, something else came too. A different kind of spirit, hungrier, older, and far crueler, drawn to the village's suffering the way flies are drawn to a wound. This spirit found the shrine while the true guardians were weakened, fighting to hold back the famine's worst effects, and it seized the seat of power while they were too exhausted to stop it. The true guardians did not die. They were driven out, sealed away in the deep bush beyond the village, unable to return as long as the false spirit held the shrine and held the village's faith. And faith, Mama Nneka explained, was the exact fuel the false spirit needed to keep its grip. Every act of fearful obedience, every cruelty committed in the god's name, fed it, strengthened it, let it sink its roots deeper into Eke-Oba's soil and its people's hearts. And the priest? Adaeze asked, her voice barely above a whisper, though something in her chest had already begun to understand with a sickness what the answer would be. Baba Iyase serves it, Mama Neka said. Whether he believes he serves the gods or whether he simply enjoys the power it gives him, I cannot say. Perhaps even he no longer remembers which is true. But every rule he enforces, every person he marks with that red cord, feeds the thing wearing the mask of your gods. It has been feeding for 200 years, child, and in all that time, you are the very first person whose heart it could not bend. Why me? Mama Neka studied her for a long moment, the firelight from a distant compound catching the deep lines of her ancient face. Because your conscience answers to something the false spirit cannot reach. It can frighten people. It can starve them, sicken them, threaten them with curses until they hand over their own judgment just to make the fear stop. But it cannot touch a heart that refuses, simply and completely, to let fear replace love. That is the one thing it has never learned to corrupt. That is why every cruel command it has ever given, you have answered it with its opposite. Not because you decided to rebel, but because your heart would not let you do otherwise. Adaeze sat with that truth long after Mama Neka disappeared back into the dark. And she did disappear, the way mist disappears, there one breath and gone the next, leaving Adaeze alone with a secret too enormous to carry by herself and too dangerous to share with anyone who might run straight to Baba Iyase with it. But staying silent was no longer a choice the world was willing to make her make. 3 days later, the rains failed to come. The sacred festival was still 2 weeks away, 2 weeks before the village would be permitted to plant a single seed according to the rule that had stood unbroken for 2 centuries. But the sky stayed merciless and blue, day after day, and the soil that should have been soft and ready cracked instead into hard red plates, and the elders began to murmur with real fear in their voices this time, that if the planting was delayed even 1 more week past the usual rains, there would not be enough harvest to survive the coming year. Children were already thinner than they should have been. Adaeze had seen it in Chiedu's little sisters, in the hollow places beneath their eyes. She had seen it in half the compounds in Eke-Oba, where mothers stretched 1 pot of soup across 3 days instead of 1. She went to Baba Iyase herself this time, walked straight up the shrine steps in front of whoever wished to watch, and asked him plainly to move the festival earlier, to let the people plant now before the dry season stole away what little chance they had left. Baba Iyase's face went the color of old ash, the same color Chiedu's skin had turned under his poison. "The gods set the date," he said. "Not me, not you. Who are you to demand the gods bend their sacred calendar to your impatience?" "The gods or you?" Adaeze said, and the words left her mouth before fear could stop them. The crowd that had gathered behind her gasped audibly, several people stepping back as though her question itself might summon lightning. Baba Iyase's eyes narrowed, and for one unguarded moment, Adaeze saw something flicker across his face that wasn't righteous fury at all. It was calculation. It was fear of his own. Not fear of the gods, but fear of being seen. Fear of being questioned in a way he had no easy answer for. "You will regret that question," he said quietly. So quietly that only Adaeze and the people closest to her heard it. Then, louder, for the whole gathered crowd, "The girl has spoken against the gods themselves. She has questioned the priest. You all heard her." It was the 3rd rule, broken in front of everyone, with no river or healer's hut nearby to hide what she had done. Here is where everything changes, where the story stops circling and goes straight for the throat. if you've made it this far, you already know this girl deserves better than what's coming. Stay with me, because the next part of this tale is the reason it survived for 2 centuries. They came for her that very night. Adaeze's mother begged at the door of their hut, on her knees, weeping, asking the shrine attendants to take her instead, to spare her daughter. But the attendants, men Adaeze had known her whole life, men who once let her chase their chickens as a child, would not meet her mother's eyes. They simply lifted Adaeze, bound her wrists with the same kind of cord used to mark the doomed, and carried her up the hill toward the shrine, toward the forbidden grove where Chiedu was once left to die. But this time was different. This time, Baba Yase did not intend simply to abandon her and let the village's fear do the rest of the work. This time, he intended to bury her, to seal her beneath the roots of the oldest Iroko tree, alive as a final, irreversible offering meant to silence, once and for all, the only voice in 200 years that had dared to question the shrine. The grave was already dug when they brought her to it. Baba Yase stood at its edge in the moonlight, his cowrie necklace gleaming, his voice carrying easily over the small, terrified crowd that had followed at a careful distance, too afraid to intervene and too horrified to look away. "The gods demand silence," he announced. "Tonight they will have it." Adaeze looked up at him, not with the terror he expected, but with something far stranger. Pity. "You're not afraid of the gods. You're afraid of me. You're afraid of what happens if the whole village finally asks why a poison boy lived, why a stranger's blessing never turned to curse, why every single time someone broke your rules out of love, nothing terrible ever came. You're not protecting them from the gods, Baba Yase. You're protecting yourself from being seen." For one heartbeat, the priest's composure cracked entirely. His hand trembled, his mouth opened as though to argue, and found no argument waiting for. Then the wind changed. It came from the deep bush beyond the village, not the soft evening breeze Eke-Oba knew, but a wind with weight to it, a wind that smelled of rain that had been missing for weeks, a wind that bent the Iroko branches low and made every torch flame gutter sideways at once. The crowd cried out. Baba Yase staggered back from the grave's edge, his cowrie necklace suddenly clattering against his chest like something trying to escape. Out of that wind came shapes. Not monstrous, not the clawed horrors the village had spent 200 years fearing, but figures of woven light and shadow, as tall as the Iroko trees themselves, moving with a slow, ancient dignity that made even the bravest men in that crowd drop to their knees. The true guardians had returned. They did not speak in words exactly, but every person in that clearing understood them anyway, the way you understand a mother's grief without needing her to explain it. They had been waiting, the guardians made clear, 200 years for a single heart strong enough to hold the door open from the inside, because a thing that has seized a shrine through fear cannot be driven out from the outside by force. It can only be undone when the people it has been feeding on finally stop feeding it. Every rule Adaeze had broken, every act of love she had refused to abandon despite the cost, had been quietly starving the false spirit that had ruled Eke-Oba for 2 centuries. And tonight, with the entire village watching, with her own grave dug and ready beneath her knees, that starving had finally reached its breaking point. Baba Iyase tried to run. He did not get far. The false spirit he had served, whatever it truly was beneath 200 years of borrowed holiness, could not hold its shape any longer without the fear and grief it needed to survive. And as the guardian's light swept across the shrine grounds, it could not hide inside the old priest's heart any longer either. The two of them, priest and parasite, were consumed together in a fire that started at the shrine's altar and raced up through every dry timber of that ancient structure, lighting the night sky over Eke-Oba in a blaze the whole village would talk about for the rest of their lives. Adaeze's bonds fell away on their own, the cord unraveling like it had never truly held any power at all. She did not run from the burning shrine. She walked toward her mother, who reached her halfway, and the two of them held each other in the firelight, while the rest of the village watched the lie that had ruled their lives for 200 years burn down to ash before sunrise. Now you understand why this story has lasted 2 centuries, but the ending isn't quite what you think yet. There's one more piece left, and it's the part that turns this from a story you watch into a story you remember. Don't go anywhere. In the weeks that followed, Eke-Oba changed in ways the village could not have imagined possible even a season earlier. The true guardians did not demand a new shrine, did not demand new rules, did not ask the village to simply trade one set of impossible sacrifices for another. They asked for almost nothing at all. The same small offerings they had asked for 200 years before. A handful of kola nut, a song at harvest, and beneath all of it, one quiet, unspoken request that the village never again let fear stand in for conscience. The festival was moved that very season. The rains, as it turned out, had nothing at all to do with sacred calendars. They came when they came, and the planting happened when the soil and the sky agreed it should happen. And that year's harvest, free for the first time in living memory from the old rule's rigid timing, came in fuller than anyone in Eke-Oba could remember. Chiedu grew strong, eventually became a farmer with hands as steady as the healer woman's once were, and he never once let a season pass without leaving an offering at Adaeze's mother's door, quietly, without ceremony, as though gratitude that deep didn't need an audience to be real. The stranger Adaeze had saved that first rainy night was never seen again, though years later, an old trader passing through Eke-Oba swore he had once shared a fire far to the north with a man who told a story about a girl with a heart too brave for her own village, and who had asked the trader if his road ever bent toward Eke-Oba again, to leave word that the man he saved had lived a long and grateful life because of her. As for Mama Neka, no one in Eke-Oba ever saw her again after that night by the river. Some said she had simply been a traveling wisdom keeper, the kind every region of that land sometimes produced, who moved on once her purpose in a place was finished. Others, the old grandmothers especially, the ones who told this story to their grandchildren by firelight for generations afterwards, insisted that Mama Neka had been one of the true guardians herself, walking in human shape, watching over the one heart in 200 years that the false spirit could never quite reach. Adaeze lived the rest of her days in Eke-Oba, not as a cursed girl anymore, not as an outcast, but as something the village had never quite had a word for before, a woman whose conscience the people learned slowly and humbly to trust more than they trusted authority itself. When her own daughter was born years later, she did not raise her on a list of rules to obey without question. She raised her on a single lesson instead, the only lesson that had ever truly mattered in that whole long, terrible, beautiful story. Never surrender your conscience simply because someone claims divine authority. Power that demands your silence is never holy. Power that needs your fear to survive was never a god at all. And that is the story of Adaeze, the only girl in the village who never listened to the gods because she was the only one who could still hear her own heart over the sound of everyone else's fear. If this story moved you even a little, That's exactly why I tell these tales, and there are so many more like it waiting for you. Subscribe now, because the next story might just be the one that changes the way you see the world too. Until then, take care of yourselves and never, ever stop listening to your own heart.